One moment she was standing tall, the next the future queen crumpled to the palace floor. And what the royal doctor said next left everyone in tears. The royal gala had been billed as the event of the season, a dazzling evening meant to quiet the swirling rumors about Catherine's health and reaffirm her place as the steadfast heart of the monarchy. Journalists outside Kensington Palace spoke in hushed tones about her resilience and style as they waited to catch a glimpse of her arrival. Inside the grand hall, the air was thick with expectation, and flashes of cameras bounced off polished marble. When she entered, dressed impeccably, a faint smile gracing her lips, all doubts seemed to vanish. Guests rose to their feet, applauding the future queen who appeared to have overcome every obstacle placed before her. But beneath her composed exterior, something darker brewed a silent struggle that no amount of grave could conceal forever. The first sign came in the form of a fleeting tremor in her hands as she reached to greet an ambassador. Then her smile faltered. Witnesses close to her table say the light in her eyes dimmed, her shoulders slackened, and before anyone could comprehend what was happening, Catherine's knees buckled. The room fell into a chilling silence, as though time itself had stopped. Gasps cut through the quiet as she crumpled to the floor before horrified guests, her body folding under the weight of a battle she had been fighting in secret. Palace staff sprung to life, abandoning protocol in a frantic bid to reach her. Yet even in the chaos, all eyes turned to William. Those nearby say he was frozen, staring in disbelief as his wife, the woman who had carried the monarchy through storms of scandal and scrutiny, lay helpless. His lips moved, whispering something only she could hear, but his words were drowned out by the sound of heels clattering and radios crackling as aides called for the doctor. From the press area just beyond the closed doors, whispers began to leak. Reporters pressed their ears to the gilded walls, catching fragments of frantic conversations. Words like urgent and not fainting floated through the air, sending a chill down their spines. Outside, cameras kept rolling, capturing the grim faces of officials rushing in and out. The medical team arrived swiftly, kneeling by her side as William hovered above her, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. But when the royal doctor, a man known for his calm under pressure, emerged moments later, his expression alone told the gathered crowd that this was no ordinary incident. It wasn't exhaustion, it wasn't stressful, and it certainly wasn't something they could downplay as a momentary lapse. His somber face betrayed a deeper, more devastating reality, one that, within minutes, would spark a panic through the palace and beyond. But the real devastation would only begin when the doctor uttered the words no royal wanted to hear. As the royal doctor emerged, his words weren't just medical, they were a thunderclap that shattered William's composure entirely. Inside the suffocating quiet of that room, William sat by Catherine's side, his knuckles white as he gripped her hand. Witnesses say his lips barely moved, whispering, "Stay with me," over and over, as though sheer will alone could keep her anchored. But the royal doctor's solemn face said otherwise. When he finally spoke, even his carefully chosen words couldn't soften the blow. He leaned in close to William, and though his voice was low, those who lingered nearby still caught the devastating phrase, "It's progressed far faster than we thought." The words hit William like a hammer. People in the room swear they saw his shoulders drop, his breath catch, and his face drain of all color. One aide, who had worked for the family for more than a decade, later admitted they'd never seen a member of the royal family weep in public until that moment. William staggered back, his composure completely shattered, tears welling despite every instinct to contain them. Even the staff who stood silently around them could feel the air thicken with despair, each second stretched by the sound of his breaking voice. In a flurry of muted urgency, senior family members were summoned in secret. Texts were sent to phones that never rang in public. Private cars slipped quietly through back gates, their windows darkened, carrying the Queen Consort, Princess Anne, and other close relatives into the hospital's restricted wing. Catherine was wheeled away into a secure, guarded area, while William stood motionless, unable or unwilling to follow immediately. As the hours ticked by, the palace descended into chaos. The communications team huddled in corners of the hall, whispering furiously about what to tell the press camped outside. Too little, and the rumors would consume them. Too much, and the monarchy's carefully constructed image of strength would crumble before their eyes. There was no precedent for what they were facing, and it showed in every frantic glance, every hurried phone call, every tightening jaw among them. Later that night, cameras waiting in the dark captured the haunting sight of William stepping out of the palace. No wave, no acknowledgement, no reassurance, just a hollow, broken man, his eyes cast downward, his face betraying a storm of grief he could no longer hide. The flashes of cameras briefly illuminated him, but nothing could brighten the darkness hanging over his figure as he climbed into the waiting car. But the palace's silence only allowed darker whispers to spread, and the public began demanding answers. When the palace refuses to speak, the people start listening to the whispers, and these whispers were deafening. By dawn, the story was already spiraling far beyond the palace gates. What had begun as a chilling scene at a royal gala now ignited a media firestorm of speculation and accusation. Across every television channel, every newspaper, every corner of the internet, Catherine's name burned like a fuse. Headlines clashed violently, some insisting she was recovering comfortably, others hinting at something far darker. Journalists camped outside the hospital claimed to see doctors coming and going at odd hours, their faces drawn and grim. The royal press office, however, stayed infuriatingly vague, describing her condition as stable and routine, though witnesses reported a frenzy inside. That thin facade of control only deepened the public's suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Former aides, emboldened by the vacuum of official truth, began speaking to reporters under the cloak of anonymity. One described a prolonged and private battle, calling it a rare, degenerative illness she'd been hiding for years. Another claimed that her collapse was inevitable, and that she'd been quietly preparing her family for the worst since late last year. These revelations added a chilling depth to what the world had dismissed as exhaustion or stress. But the most damning blow came when leaked internal emails began circulating among reporters, documents purportedly showing palace staff debating end-of-life care, even discussing funeral protocols. The idea that such conversations had already taken place left even loyal insiders in disbelief. Inconsistencies in palace statements only stoked the flames. On one hand, official spokespeople repeated the narrative of routine treatment, yet leaks described a critical condition that required intensive, around-the-clock monitoring. Journalists began openly questioning how such contradictions could exist without deliberate deceit. A respected royal correspondent, visibly shaken on air, asked outright, "What is the palace hiding from us?" Social media became a breeding ground for wilder, more desperate theories. Some claimed William and Charles were locked in private discussions about abdication, preparing for a handover of power. Others whispered of a cover-up that the monarchy itself was orchestrating an elaborate distraction to protect its fragile image. Videos of Catherine's earlier public appearances were replayed, dissected frame by frame for signs of her hidden suffering. Then, on Sunday morning, the royal family appeared together at church, walking side by side under the flash of cameras. But the silence in their eyes spoke louder than words. William's expression, in particular, caught everyone's attention, described by one observer as haunted. His gaze fixed ahead as if carrying a weight too heavy to bear. And just when speculation reached a fever pitch, someone inside the palace finally broke ranks. A loyal aide once sworn to secrecy decided the truth was too painful to hide any longer. In the suffocating silence that gripped the palace, the tension finally cracked where no one expected inside the very heart of the royal household. A senior aide, long regarded as one of the most discreet and devoted members of Catherine's inner circle, quietly reached out to a trusted royal journalist. What they revealed would send shockwaves through the monarchy and devastate the nation. The aide confirmed what the whispers had only hinted at. Catherine's diagnosis was not just serious, it was terminal and untreatable. The words themselves were like a dagger, piercing through layers of denial and polished statements, forcing the world to confront the unthinkable. According to the side, the illness had been identified months earlier, during what was meant to be a routine examination. Even then, the prognosis was grim, but Catherine, determined not to disrupt the fragile stability of the monarchy, kept it hidden from the world. She continued to fulfill her duties, even as her strength waned and the pain crept into every corner of her life. The aide described in harrowing detail how, at recent public events, Catherine would smile through clenched teeth, gripping William's arm not just for show, but to steady herself when waves of weakness threatened to topple her. Every handshake, every wave to the crowd, was a performance of strength, hiding a private torment. And yet, she refused to slow down, convinced that stepping back would dishonor the Queen's legacy and betray the faith of those who looked to her as a symbol of resilience. In moments away from the cameras, the truth was far harder to watch. The aide recounted nights when Catherine would retreat to her private quarters, only to collapse into William's arms as soon as the doors closed behind them. They spoke of muffled sobs echoing through the corridors, of a woman torn between her own survival and her duty to the crown. And then came the most jarring revelation, one that would haunt even the staunchest defenders of the monarchy. The leak suggested that behind closed doors, discussions had already begun to announce a regency, preparing the public for a transition of power. Not because she was unfit to serve, but because she would soon be unable to stand at all. These revelations were not just heartbreaking, they were infuriating. The notion that she had endured this agony in silence, expected to wear her suffering as gracefully as a tiara, ignited something raw and unforgiving in the hearts of the public. But the public's heartbreak turned to outrage as they learned just how much she endured alone and in silence. Behind every poised wave and perfect smile was a woman waging a war the cameras never saw. As the palace clung to silence and the public clung to hope, a different story was playing out in the hidden chambers of royal life. A story no camera dared to capture. Reports from insiders and medical staff began to paint a devastating picture of a princess not just battling an illness, but fighting through relentless waves of pain that never seemed to let go. The treatments were grueling, the side effects unrelenting. Nausea, fatigue, sudden blackouts, symptoms that chipped away at her physical strength and stole precious moments of peace. But it wasn't just her body that suffered. The emotional toll was far greater. She was enduring the slow unraveling of everything she had once taken for granted, her role, her strength, even her time. Catherine, ever composed in public, reportedly kept a private journal during this time in a sacred space where the royal mask slipped away. In it, she wrote of sleepless nights and silent fears, her handwriting growing shakier as the weeks wore on. Pages filled with heartbreak, where she admitted her greatest terror, not living long enough to see her children grow up. These weren't the words of a princess, but of a mother clinging to the hope that tomorrow might still come. Despite the severity of her condition, those closest to her say Catherine insisted on fulfilling every royal obligation she physically could. Even after collapsing in private more than once, she would stand before crowds, her back straight and her smile unwavering. To the public, she was elegance personified, but to those within the palace walls, she was a woman held together by sheer willpower and painkillers. Her determination alarmed even her closest friends. William, according to one source, begged her to stop. He pleaded with her to let others step in. But her response was always the same: the people deserve their princess. Behind closed doors in Norfolk, where the family often sought peace, staff recalled hearing her cry in the late hours of the night. The sound of her sobs drifting down quiet hallways became familiar, each one a haunting reminder that even royalty can break. She hid it from the cameras, from the crowds, from the world, but she couldn't hide it from herself. Not anymore. Doctors, growing more alarmed by her deterioration, reportedly warned her that she was on borrowed time, that continuing at this pace would only accelerate her decline. But Catherine, driven by duty, love, and perhaps something deeper, chose to ignore it. She was not ready to let go. Not of her family, not of her people, not of the legacy she believed she had yet to fulfill. Yet even as her body faltered, she summoned one last act of defiance that would leave the world breathless. When the doors opened, and she stepped onto that balcony, no one knew it might be her final bow. For days, palace doctors had begged her to stay inside, to rest, to accept that her body could no longer endure the strain. But Catherine, unshaken and resolute, chose otherwise. Against every stern warning and every fearful glance, she appeared at the king's birthday parade fragile, yet impossibly radiant. The hush that swept over the waiting crowd was instantaneous, a collective gasp at the sight of her framed against the grandeur of the palace. The woman they'd seen only in headlines of despair now stood before them. Thinner than they remembered, her grip tight on the railing, as though every ounce of strength was being summoned just to remain upright. The streets, lined with thousands who had feared they might never see her again, erupted into applause and sobs. People wept openly as they looked up at her, the future queen who stood against her own failing body to give them this moment. But those watching closely could see the cost. Her posture was stiff, her face pale despite the smile she wore for them all. At her side, William stood unwavering, yet his eyes betrayed him red-rimmed, brimming with something between pride and unbearable sorrow. He stayed close enough that his hand brushed hers now and then, as though silently ready to catch her should she falter. Then came the moment that struck the nation silent. Photographers caught Catherine bending toward her children, whispering softly as she crouched to their level. "Just like Mummy," she murmured, coaxing them to wave to the crowds below. The children's small hands lifted into the air, mirroring hers, and for a fleeting instant, the entire royal family seemed frozen in a tableau of grace, resilience, and heartbreak. Onlookers later described those few minutes as both triumphant and tragic, an unspoken goodbye played out before an audience of millions. To many, she seemed to stand not as a princess fighting illness, but as a symbol of something bigger. A woman refusing to let go of the people and the duty she loved, no matter the cost. But the cost came swiftly. That evening, long after the applause faded and the crowds had dispersed, whispers leaked from behind palace walls. Catherine had collapsed again, this time more violently than before, leaving aides scrambling in hushed panic. Physicians rushed to her chambers, their faces grave. Even among staff hardened by years of royal crisis, the fear that she'd pushed herself too far this time was impossible to ignore. But it was what she said that night quietly, to her children, that would haunt Britain forever. As the palace grew quiet, Catherine gathered her children and spoke words that no mother ever wants to say. That evening, after the crowd's cheers had faded and the cameras had long been packed away, the palace corridors were heavy with silence. But behind one nursery door, a scene unfolded that would leave even the most stoic staff fighting back tears. Insiders say Catherine, fragile from the day's ordeal but still determined, summoned George, Charlotte, and Louis to her side. She sat with them privately, her voice soft yet unwavering, and began speaking words that no child should ever have to hear from their mother. She told them to always look after each other and never forget what really matters: kindness, courage, and family, above all. William stood nearby, witnesses say, but he didn't speak. He simply watched her, silent and shattered, tears running freely down his face. He knew, as she did, that this wasn't just a conversation, but a farewell of sorts, an attempt to leave pieces of herself with them while she still could. Then came the part that broke even the hardened staff outside her door. According to those present, Catherine handed each of her children a sealed envelope, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them in their tiny palms. She instructed them gently not to open the letters until they were much older, saying only that what was inside would help them understand everything when the time came. Even the palace aides, sworn to discretion, admitted later they couldn't hold it together. Hearing her quiet words drift through the nursery walls, her tone, full of both sorrow and determination, echoed like a lullaby of love and heartbreak intertwined. The next morning, the children were seen clinging to her before she was moved to the hospital again. Charlotte clutching her mother's sleeve, Louis hiding his face in her lap, and George standing stoically, though his lip quivered as he tried to mimic his father's strength. It was a portrait of a family coming apart, yet desperately holding itself together for just a little longer. And yet, just when Britain began mourning, a shocking twist turned everything upside down. When the full truth finally came out, it was even darker and more complicated than anyone imagined. After days of mounting pressure, whispered leaks, and public outrage, the palace was forced to break its silence. That morning, a royal spokesman appeared before the press to deliver the statement Britain had been dreading. Catherine's illness was confirmed as an aggressive and extraordinarily rare condition. The official diagnosis sent shockwaves through the nation, not only for its severity but for the chilling acknowledgement that it had advanced beyond expectations. Yet even that revelation failed to fully prepare the public for what came next. The statement admitted, in carefully chosen language, that the condition may have been mismanaged in its earliest stages. It appeared that opportunities to intervene had been missed opportunities that could have slowed the disease or lessened her suffering. Behind palace doors, internal questions of negligence flared, and the trust that had been so carefully built between the royals and their people began to splinter. According to insiders, fingers began pointing almost immediately. Some blamed senior royal advisors, accusing them of deliberately downplaying medical concerns to protect the monarchy's image and to ensure Catherine continued her public duties. Others whispered that doctors had been pressured to soften their assessments, painting a rosier picture than reality to avoid unsettling the fragile balance of power within the family. Speculations swirled that the palace itself had become complicit in her decline, prioritizing the optics of strength and continuity over her well-being. That notion ignited fury across the nation, sparking headlines that spoke of betrayal at the highest level. People demanded to know whether Catherine, even in her most vulnerable moments, had been quietly coerced into appearances she should never have endured, all in the name of royal tradition. As journalists dug deeper, reports emerged of investigations into whether she'd been pressed to appear at the king's birthday parade, despite clear warnings from her doctors that her condition was too precarious. The thought that her heroic display might have been forced, rather than chosen, left many struggling to reconcile their admiration with the ugly possibility of exploitation. But it was the final line of the statement that froze the world in place. Delivered without embellishment, yet heavy enough to silence every room it reached, the words echoed with finality. "We cannot predict how long Her Royal Highness has left." The crowd of reporters fell quiet, their pens still mid-air. In that instant, the gravity of what she'd been enduring, and what little time remained, settled like a shadow over Britain. But even in her weakest moment, Catherine's final vow left Britain stunned and determined to honor her fight. Catherine may have collapsed, but in doing so, she stood taller than any crown could make her. In the days following the devastating revelation, the nation did not retreat into quiet grief. Instead, it erupted in an extraordinary show of love and solidarity for the woman who had given everything to her people. Outside Kensington Palace, the gates became buried in an endless tide of flowers, letters, and candles. Notes from children called her "our Princess of Strength," while strangers who had never met her whispered prayers into the chill of the morning air. The world, watching from afar, seemed to pause not to mourn her decline, but to honor her courage. For once, the monarchy's centuries-old rituals gave way to something deeply human. Crowds didn't wait for palace statements anymore. They wrote their own tributes, shared their own stories, spoke their gratitude aloud to a woman who had reminded them what dignity looked like, even in the darkest hours. Amid this emotional swell, William emerged not as a prince bound by tradition, but as a man inspired by his wife's resolve. In a brief and heartfelt message, he pledged to carry her message forward, to ensure that humanity would never again take second place to royal protocol. His words struck a chord, echoing the quiet defiance she had shown all along. Then came the announcement that sealed her legacy into something far larger than her title. A new charity was unveiled in her name, dedicated to supporting families fighting hidden illnesses, those too proud or too voiceless to ask for help until it was too late. It was said to have been her final request, a way to turn her private struggle into hope for countless others. The public, inspired by her ordeal, began to demand more transparency from the palace. Conversations that had once been unthinkable now flowed openly about the costs of silence, about the balance between duty and humanity, about whether the monarchy could evolve into something gentler, more honest, more real. Catherine's story had cracked something open in the British psyche, leaving behind not only sorrow but also determination to do better. And yet, amid the grand statements and sweeping changes, it was a single moment that endured in the hearts of millions. A photograph captured on her last day at the hospital of Catherine standing at a window, pale but smiling, raising her hand in a quiet wave. Against the odds, against her pain, she still found the strength to acknowledge the crowd gathered below. That wave became the symbol of her resilience, a gesture that seemed to say, "I am still here, and so are you." And though the palace lights may dim for now, her story continues in every heart she touches. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.